Welcome to the Art of Conscious Living. I'm so very pleased today to have as a returning guest Phillip Scott. We're going to be talking about the Native American Indian ways and so much more about his life, his journeys, and many ideas on what to do about today's world, of the concerns of the art of communicating with each other, of loving each other, and being in the art of community. Phillip, thank you. Thank you for being here again, and welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, let's start at the very beginning about your Native American way of living and being, and what that is all about.
Well, what would you like to know?
Well, I'd like to know about the sacred ceremony you do, the sweat lodge and the vision quest, and the Native American dancing that you go to, you attend each year. And so many people don't have a glimpse into your world of what it is like to live the ancient way. A lot of it has even disappeared, but you keep it very much alive. And as long as I've known you for the last decade plus, you are definitely living in the way of the sacredness, the celebration of life, and living with spirit.
Well, we actually just returned the other day from the Sierras, where I conducted it's called a hamblecha, which is a Lakota word which means crying for a dream, crying for a vision. And it's a very sacred ceremony. And it's an opportunity for individuals to have communion with the Creator, the earth, and the ancestors. As I said, it's a high ceremony, and so an individual will be sequestered in nature for up to 4 days without food, water, and sleep, and they are in a state of prayer, immersed in the natural world. At the same time, there's also a base camp where there are supporters who are eating, drinking, and sleeping for them. So that energy is being directed toward the quester so that they could have uninterrupted communion. And often we live in a time now where people are deeply questing and seeking answers for the dilemmas that confront them as human beings. And so this is a traditional practice that is actually across the board, and many indigenous cultures have some form of seeking vision in this way.
So the person is in the circle, and they're there, and they're not to leave the circle for 4 days. And are they fasting during this time?
Correct, yes. They are fasting
in
without food, water, and sleep.
And without sleep?
Yes.
Are they in prayer at this time?
Throughout, right. So they are in a constant state of prayer.
Okay.
And petitioning the ancestors and the Creator and the earth to provide them with answers. And through this process of privation, it's very humbling. And so therefore the spirits can have compassion and mercy upon them and provide them with the vision that they seek. And of course, this vision is not just exclusively for themselves. It's actually for the people, for all beings, right? So we often think about, it becomes very proprietary, my dream, my vision, but actually it's the Creator's dream for you. Then we're fulfilling our original instructions. Each and one of us has been brought here for a particular purpose. And often in our world today, there's so much forgetting rather than a remembrance of what we are here to do, to be in service to all of our relations.
Have you done one yourself?
Many times, yes.
So what was it like when you were in there? I imagine that in the beginning, there's a lot of layers will just start falling away. A lot of the fear and the concerns of the outerly world, and then you start to go more inward after the time goes on. What was your experience like?
Well, actually, there's quite a bit of preparation that's involved in advance, so that the layers that you're referring to, it's a process of purification. So there's the purification lodges, which are referred to as sweat lodges, which is not a word I prefer to employ, but so there's a whole process of preparation in advance before you embark on the quest, so that the whatever fears or issues that arise can be addressed in advance, so that you can become a holy and sacred instrument to receive this vision for the people. In my own case, I do not have fear of being in the natural world, and so for me it's it's a communion, and then actually it's an absolute blessing. And through the process of petitioning the ancestors, then you can receive dream and vision. And so in my own situation, it's to further instruct myself on how I can be an effective instrument of service.
So you would be like a modern day shaman now?
I tend not to use that word.
No?
The word shaman comes from the Tungus people of Siberia. And so it's kind of been taken up by anthropologists to reflect a full range of what would be practitioners of native medicine. So for me, shamanism is a very highly specialized practice. So we could say that all shamans are medicine people, but not all medicine people are shamans. So it's a very specific practice within native medicine that's very specialized. So the quest itself would not technically fall under the rubric of shamanism per se. And furthermore, it's problematic because unless you're Tungus, it's, as far as I'm concerned anyway, you wouldn't want to use that word to describe yourself. In fact, I just returned from Tanzania, celebrating my 50th birthday this year, and so I summited Mount Kilimanjaro and spent time with the Maasai people. And the Maasai have a word to describe their medicine people, which is known as Laibon. So the Laibon is the practitioner of native medicine and the ceremonialist in their tradition, so they don't use the word shaman. Similarly, within many native tribes here in North America and South America, they have specific words to describe their medicine people. So again, the word shaman has kind of become an anthropological term to describe what medicine people do globally, but I don't feel that that's really an accurate
So how would you like
name.
to describe yourself and the lodge? What would you call the lodge?
Well, for me, the lodge, rather than sweat lodge, I prefer to call it a purification lodge in English. But because my training has been with the Lakota people, I prefer the word inipi, which means to live. In terms of my own description of myself, I call myself a human being. So in terms of the path that I've been asked to walk, my preference is to regard myself as a practitioner of native medicine, and I am a ceremonial chief in the Lakota tradition. So there was a specific ceremony that was done to confer that role and responsibility upon me. So the word shaman is not one that I would address. And furthermore, when people call themselves a shaman, I regard that as a red flag, because for me, when we're in a process of service to other people, we wish to be humble. And even a shamanic practitioner, you're going to be serving a community of individuals. And so it's not about self-aggrandizement or self-promotion, but really about humility.
Well, this is a key word that would describe you. You're very much in service. You're very much about selflessness and giving to others and being there. When did this all start in your life?
Well, the first dream that I had was when I was 6 years old. And when I shared this dream with some of my native mentors and teachers, it was regarded as a big medicine dream. So the dream started happening when I was 6 years old, where I was being visited by spirits in my dream time. I was also sleepwalking, so I was being able to kind of walk between the worlds, both navigating the earthly plane, but in the dream time at the same time. And then when I was 7 years old, I had a near-death experience, and my father and I were involved in Indian guides. And of course, Indian guides wasn't so much about native people, but more was a pretext for fathers and son to bond together through sharing experiences. And so we had moved from the West Coast in the LA area to upstate New York, where my father had a new job as a neuroscientist. And so we joined this father and son organization, and it was my first exposure to snow. And we went sledding. and we didn't have the appropriate equipment, so we borrowed one of those rapid flyers. It's kind of a sled that's a wooden sled, but it has metal runners underneath, and you steer. You lie on top of it and you steer. Well, the sled was rusty. We didn't know that it was not able to maneuver. And seeing all the other young boys around me sliding solo down the hill, I requested of my father if I could also go alone. And he was quite reluctant, but I insisted, and so finally he acquiesced and allowed me to sled down the hill. Well, as I began to take off, I slid right toward a tree. And because I couldn't maneuver, I wasn't able to avoid the tree. And so, of course, it was my first exposure to snow and that entire environment, so I didn't have the sense, and it happened so quickly, to dig my boots into the snow to slow down, nor I was also concerned about rolling off the sled and being struck by another sledder next to me. So right at the last minute before impact, I shielded my head with my arms and struck the tree, at which point my spirit was immediately jettisoned into what I can describe as a thick, viscous darkness. And I was moving. There was a palpable sense of movement, but I didn't see any sort of classic bright light, but I definitely knew I was out of my body and moving toward some unknown trajectory. I heard the muffled sound of my name almost coming from behind me, and it was my father's voice. And then I felt a tentacle of energy wrap around my solar plexus and literally yank me back into my body. At which point, I slowly opened my eyes to see a circle of faces of all the fathers peering over me. And then I blacked out again. And then I continued to move through different levels of awareness in terms of coming to and again going out, feeling the sensation of being lifted into some kind of makeshift gurney, being slid in the back of a station wagon, seeing my father screaming and yelling at the nurse at the nursing station in the emergency room as blood is oozing from my face onto my lap, and then finally the cold pull of a steel needle through my cheek. That's when I really came to fully again.
What trauma had actually happened to you?
Yeah, well, they, according to the reports, I had blood oozing from every orifice in my face, eyes, nose, ears, and mouth. I had a large laceration on my cheek, and they were trying a novel form of surgery called plastic surgery. And so there's just a slight gash, a slight scar, where there was a large gash from the corner of my mouth to my earlobe. So, fortunately, it didn't disfigure me too much. The consequence of this impact was that, first of all, I was bedridden for quite some time because it also damaged the semicircular canals in my ears, and so I didn't have balance, and I really could not speak well. And what happened in that interim of being bedridden was I was being surrounded. I could see the spirits all around me, which was quite terrifying. But I had no way of articulating this fear to my parents because, again, I was without speech for a while.
And what age were you?
I was 7.
7 at this time.
Which was, for me, a form of madness. Literally, I could not, the cacophony of movement and sounds all around me from these spirits. But fortunately, the spirits that I had engaged with when I was 6 and had been working with in my dream time, they came to my aid and helped to sift out all of the other ancestral spirits and other spirits around me, so that I could gain a sense of coherency and sanity again. When I was able to walk and resume speaking again, I returned to school but was still quite disoriented. And they were going to keep me back because they thought I had some serious neurological damage. But I insisted on pushing through and was able to, gain, through the help of the spirits, a level of sanity returned. And so at that point, and I began to see spirits in ordinary time, but again, through my practices.
What was it like to see spirits, and what did they look like, and what kind of feeling were they conveying to you? Were they friendly, or were they neutral? Were they unfriendly? Were they? Could you see them as clear as you could see a person, or were they just in shadow, or?
The whole gamut, but basically most of the spirits I could see, you could perceive them as not corporeal, that is, not physical. They don't assume a physical form, but they could be humanoid, they could be animal forms energetically, but without substance. Some, most of them are, there's a lot of, for me this is this distinction between an ancestor and a ghost. An ancestor is a being that has walked the earth or has yet to come here and has gone back to the stars or back home, wherever they dwell, and whatever that dream is. But a ghost is an individual that is not able to travel home yet because they have unfinished business, right? There's things that did not get rectified in their lifetime, and so as a consequence, they are still trapped here in this earthly plane of awareness until some kind of resolution takes place. I personally have never seen a lot of spirits that are necessarily malevolent. A lot of them are just misplaced or don't know that they've passed. And so part of the work of a shamanic practitioner, of a certain medicine people, is to help these souls go home. And so that may be involving an intercession to help take care of whatever it is that they're not able to do. So the classic cases of displacement of objects in homes, for example, or certain sounds, isn't necessarily that these ghosts are menacing or evil per se, but rather they are attempting to gain the attention of certain people then who can help them resolve whatever needs to be taken care of, and then help them return home.
Do they communicate with you on a verbal or a telepathic way, or
some
energy
right.
way?
So some will, communicate with me directly. Some are telepathic, and others that just show me things. For example, I remember when I had taken what's called the Wakan, the sacred pipe, to green grass in South Dakota on the Cheyenne River Reservation, because they're the original calf pipe, the original sacred calf pipe, is housed there in a beautiful circular structure made out of wood, and people from all over the world will travel to pay respects to this sacred and holy instrument. And I wanted also to take the sacred pipe that I am privileged to carry and take it to the mothership, so to speak, to take it back home, so that it can make connection with the original source of the Wakan. And so there was a man who was the keeper. Now it's his son, but his name was Stanley Looking Horse. And when I located their home, I rapped on the door, and he peered through the screen door, and he looked at me, and he asked me what I wanted, and I said that I wished to visit the original Chanupa, original sacred pipe. And so he opened the door, let me in, and welcomed me graciously, and handed me a glass of water, and we sat down at this old table, just he and myself, and I offered what's called chunli, or tobacco, sacred tobacco, as a request, to request permission to be able to visit the sacred pipe. And then he got really quiet for a moment, and he said, "Does she speak to you?" Meaning, white buffalo calf woman. And I said, "No, she doesn't speak to me. She just shows me things." He said, "Good, because she doesn't speak English. She speaks Lakota." And so I think there's an understanding that English is the universal language in the spirit world, and that's just not true. So I kind of passed the test that he proposed, and we finished sharing a little bit more, and then I was granted the opportunity to visit the sacred pipe, the original calf pipe. So sometimes the spirits do not communicate in English or telepathically. Sometimes they will just show you things. Right?
Well, my experience with spirit was in New York City, and in my bedroom overlooking Central Park in the 80s, there was a man who, in front of my window in my bedroom, I had a love seat there, and he sat there for 6 years, every day. And the way I was able to see him, when I looked at the peripheral of my vision, I could see him. And he was suited up with black leather shoes, black pants, black suit jacket, white shirt with no tie, white hair that was combed back, blue eyes, and this incredible smile on his face, which was very important, because if he wasn't smiling, I guess I would be nervous that he was there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I saw him in plasma and ether kind of energy, and he never moved. He was just there beaming all of this love energy from his big, beautiful blue eyes and that big beaming smile. And he stayed there for years, and then finally I moved out of the apartment, and I went back to the owner, because it was a condo, and there was the knocking on her door years later and said, "Do you have any experience in your bedroom?" She said, "Oh yes," and she saw the same thing too, without me telling her about it. And I've had numerous other experiences with spirit. So there's a lot of people that have not had that, and they think it's not real, but I'm here to say it's extremely, very real.
Well, most indigenous cultures recognize the presence of spirits and ancestors. I mean, we wouldn't be here were it not for the ancestors. And so I think there's a categorical denial in the Western world of ancestors. And yet, every single faith tradition also has its ancestor worship, including the, Western Christian tradition. So the saints and Christ are certainly ancestors. And so, but it's not something that's commonplace. Whereas for indigenous cultures, there's a recognition of the presence of the unseen constantly.
So when you do a ceremony, a healing ceremony in the lodge, you are inviting all of the ancestors to come in there in spirit, and they're there to do healing for all the people that have gathered there. What is that experience like? What have you seen with from your own community?
Well, I'm grateful just that the ancestors are present to do the doctoring, because I'm not the one that does the healing or the doctoring. It's the ancestors that do. And for me, that's the humility that I spoke with. Any medicine person or shaman in the Tongass tradition, worth their salt, is going to give credit where credit is due. And it's hard enough for ourselves as human beings to understand what we need, let alone what someone else does. So that's why in this tradition we rely upon the ancestors, who have a vantage point and an understanding of what this individual really requires. And so we invite not all of the ancestors, because the pantheon is so vast, but the spirits of that are appropriate and necessary for this particular ceremony, as well as for all the individuals that are present. And then, of course, each medicine person will also have spirits that they work with in relationship to their altar, whether that altar comes from a teacher or a family or a tribe. So the spirits that are appropriate to the altar, as well as for the individuals present, as well as for the ceremony, they are invoked to do the healing and the doctoring. And I have been witness to many doctorings and healings which could be regarded as miracles within the Western allopathic paradigm. And there are people today that are alive as a result of these doctoring and healing ceremonies that are thousands and thousands of years old. I mean, indigenous medicine is the most ancient form of healing on the planet. It's also probably the most misunderstood, the most marginalized as well.
So we have people that are coming in with physical ailments of disease, and the ancient spirits are working on the physical, through the spiritual level. They're
Correct.
healing on a spiritual, emotional level, and that's where the highest work is done. There's things that need to be worked out or resolved, or imbalances, and all of those are brought into more of harmony, and then the physical just heals itself.
Well, it's really, for me, the other beauty of Indigenous medicine is that it is a complete system that addresses all aspects of our humanity. So body, mind, heart, and spirit, all of them are addressed. Certainly, for most illnesses and imbalances in our world, dis-ease, there is a spiritual etiology. There is an origin that is sacred at the heart of the matter, which the spirits are able to address and rectify. And so there's a ripple effect as a consequence. But the other beauty of Indigenous medicine is that you may be spending more than just a few moments with an individual. Some of the healing ceremonies that we have are 9 days long, and so it's a whole process of immersion into the true source of the imbalance to help bring about wholeness. Well, wholeness for me is a little problematic term, but for balance and for harmony.
So during that 9 days, what is actually happening? Is there talk? Is there counseling? Or is there just listening to heart, listening to the whispers of what is profoundly going on that may not be realized?
All of the above, right? So we're inviting the spirits naturally to be there. In Hawaii, they call it talking story, right? So you are listening to the story of the individual, but you're also listening to what's not being shared, as well as listening to what the spirits are imparting to you to effectively be an instrument of service for this individual who's suffering. And then there's any number of modalities. I mean, Native medicine is also a multi-modality system. So, you may be doing forms of body work, of massage, sound healing. There may be ceremonial, ritual components. You may be working with plant medicines as well. So there's many different modalities, all of which would be utilized provided the spirits are directing you in that way to bring about the balance and the harmony of the individual.
Philip, do you think that suffering is absolutely necessary for people's lives to work their way through, to come to consciousness? Is it something that is not totally relevant and necessary? Is there other ways of being? I think a lot of times we, as society, are addicted to suffering, and then henceforth the victimhood. Is there another way that could absolutely replace that or come into balance with that, which would be the opposite, would be love? And how many people actually would surrender to love when they're so used to the suffering?
Well, I don't think that it's an either-or proposition per se. I regard that we live in a world of impermanence, and it's a delicate dance between life and death. And as a result of love, there's going to be suffering, because we will grieve as human beings. We're touched by loss in any way, shape, or form, whether that be the loss of a beloved or the loss of a home through a fire, the loss of a pet. So we have many different forms of loss, which engenders suffering. Even the Buddha said that the first noble truth is that life is suffering, but he didn't stop there. And I think what you're referring to is the indulgence in the suffering, which creates the victimization.
The attachment. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I don't believe necessarily that attachments are unhealthy, because love is a form of attachment. I think it's when it becomes unhealthy, when attachment is unhealthy, that it can cause greater suffering and pain.
Well, let's talk on a personal level then. I know that you had a great loss of a loved one, a beautiful woman that you had loved.
My wife.
Your wife. And she passed on. And would you share that with me, what happened and how the process of what we're talking about, the non-attachment, the grieving, the pain, the suffering of it, and the release of all of it. What was this journey like?
An arduous one. Well, without going into too much detail about it, she was visiting my adopted Lakota grandmother, which was her grandmother as well, on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And there was a vehicular accident which caused her death, which catapulted me on a journey of grief and absolute devastation. And it's been a long journey. I would say that as a result of that, I embarked on an odyssey. I don't believe that you ever get over your grief, but rather the grief transforms. It takes on a different form as your relationship to the story changes, and we grow as a result. Now, my immersion in my journey of grief was as a result of Cecilia's journey home, extraordinarily profound, because I sought out healing. So it brought me in closer touch with many of the indigenous traditions that involve ceremonies for the bereaved. Unfortunately, I feel that our Western civilization is rather anemic when it comes to bereavement and addressing the reality of grief. There's a
lot of denial to it.
Well, certainly, fundamentally, I think there's denial of death. Right? There's so much of a deification of youth in our culture nowadays, right? We're afraid of becoming an elder, of growing older, because of what happens to our elders in society. They're often forgotten, they're isolated in homes, rather than, within a tribal community context, there's an intergenerational relationship between the youth and the elders, right? Whereas in our society today, an elder is dismissed as of being no longer of any value.
And this is, by all intents and purposes, so wrong, because they carry all of the experience and all the wisdom. And if you are forsaking your elder, you're really forsaking your entire world or yourself.
Well, because they have a rich wisdom which
Yes.
can be drawn from. Right? That's in indigenous cultures, they're known as the wisdom keepers. So we want to have them woven into the fabric of our society and culture, and not forgotten or forsaken, as you have beautifully expressed. So there's the categorical denial of death, and by extension, grief. There's the 4 days bereavement leave and get back to work, whereas many indigenous cultures, you are going to be in a shifted state of awareness, in contact with your beloved or with the spirit of the person for a minimum of 13 moons, so 1 year. And I know that within the Jewish tradition, there is a practice of sitting Shiva, and within that organized religion, there's definitely very elaborate practices, and even within the Buddhist tradition, many ceremonies that are done and observed. But in general, I think there's an avoidance of death and grief, and so with that, there's a compounding of grief, as losses tend to mount as we get older in our lives. Whereas if we can embrace grief and suffering, then through that journey, as I said, we never get over our grief, but our relationship to it changes. And so even as the Buddha pointed out in the other 3 noble truths, they're antidotes to suffering. So we can either stay just stuck in suffering and indulge, or through ceremonial practices, through sacred ways, through immersion in nature. Nature was a very important part of my own healing process, as well as the compassion and empathy that I received from medicine people who were conducting ceremonies on my behalf.
So that's during that year of your wife's death?
Not just 1 year, actually. There were, I would say, things began to transform after about 4 years, where I wasn't so deeply embedded in the grief any longer. And that's really what I see, that if one is really aware of oneself and the emotions that arise. I mean, grief is an extraordinarily unpredictable emotion, and unfortunately I think in the psychological literature, how it's categorized, the stages that we go through are really quite arbitrary. We could actually go through all of those stages in one moment. So,
well, the final stage is the acceptance. Is that the goal, or is that the ultimate, or is that
well, again, I don't
where
think
one is
that,
looking to arrive to?
I don't necessarily believe that. I think that there's a process of deeper surrender, and I guess you could call it acceptance. But again, it's not like a discrete stage, because the grief can be triggered again. You know, perhaps years and years go by and you hear a song on the radio, and it reminds you of a moment that you had with your beloved, for example. There's also cyclicity, there's seasonal, you know, so it could be as, you know, I approach particular anniversaries, there's a more tender-heartedness and sensitivity to what's happening. So it's really being present to what I see as grief as being a part of the human journey. And fundamentally, it's about how we can become more genuine human beings and to touch into the heart of our humanity, which means that there's going to be compassion, and that in certain cases there will be empathy. For me, you know, not all of the people that I sought out could empathize. You know, as the most effective people in my healing, besides Mother Nature and the spirits that were communicating with me, as well as my wife from the other side, because for almost about 3.5 years after her passing, she visited me every night in the dream time. So we continued to have, you know, a abiding relationship, which we still do to this day. I mean, she will visit on occasion when I'm doing my ceremonies, and she comes in different forms, whether it be a hummingbird or a blue dragonfly. So she'll show herself in different ways. But that's the ancestors are always here.
And how do you recognize that it's actually her in these forms?
Because I know
feel
and
her
feel
essence,
her energetic signature.
Ah.
All of us have a particular energetic signature, and so I know that she is there.
Okay.
And there's certain confirmations that are there. So therefore we have antidotes to suffering. You know, we understand that it's a part of life, but that we don't have to be paralyzed or stunted or arrested in our growth and evolution, that it's actually a part of the journey. We often tend to desire our spiritual life to be free of pain and adversity and suffering. But if you really look at the essence of birth, you know, I regard this, I see birth as a metaphor, and I have had the privilege of conducting ceremony while actual souls are coming into this world through the womb of a woman. And it's a miracle to see birth and to be present, to witness this rite of passage from the spirit world into the earthly domain. But for me, that's a metaphor. There's going to be obstruction. There's going to be challenges in the form either of the cervix or of the uterine contractions, right? And so there's going to be difficulty that will arise in the course of our awakening. And if we understand that it's a part of the challenge, then we can embrace this challenge and say that this is how we evolve. This is how we transcend to our next level of emergence, right? And so we are in a time now of great potency collectively, not only individually, but collectively. And so there is these challenges that we're speaking of. So our entire humanity is being birthed. And there's a chance for us to go to new levels of awakening and emergence as a result, provided we stop sleeping.
Right. This is so profoundly true of what you're saying, Philip. And I would very much like to address that, because I'm awestruck of how so many people are sleeping, and I know why they're sleeping, due to their lack of choices or their unconsciousness of their food choices and of the control. And there's a lot of suppression going on, and a lot of people that are not even aware that they are actually sleeping in that unawareness of being and walking and being, thinking that they're alive, but they're not.
Mm-hmm.
So let's address that. How could one escape the ravages of being in this stupor of sleep, and they're not even aware that they're in that sleep and in this unconsciousness? The greater masses of people across the planet are in this state, and it's more apparent now in the last information age, in the last 10 years, and more so than ever.
Mm-hmm. If we distill the essence of our humanity to really understand why we're here, I fundamentally see four purposes for our presence here. One is to wake up, to stop the slumber, right? And there are countless practices in many different spiritual traditions to allow us to see the places where we sleep and where we are, the knee-jerk reactionism. And I don't believe it's just one way. There are many paths that lead to the source. And so when the path beckons, if one is willing to embrace that and follow that with one's full heart, then there's an opportunity to examine the patterning, to examine the conditioning, to look at the wounding, what I regard as the burden bundles, right? We are bequeathed burden bundles in our life, right? So at the moment of birth, when mystery merges and coalesces with matter, right, spirit comes in, right? And at that moment of coalescence, we're bequeathed two bundles. One is the burden bundle, and one is the blessing bundle. And inside the burden bundle are the wounds, pain, fears, traumas of our families of origin, both maternal and paternal lines. Similarly, we're bequeathed a blessing bundle. And inside that bundle are the gifts, attributes, and talents of our families of origin. Now, as we walk in our lives, we begin to see these patterns emerging. And some of them belong to us, and some of them don't. So when we've had enough of seeing these patterns, then it's time for us to open and examine with very deliberate intention what's inside these bundles, because they burst open automatically as we begin to work and live as human beings. And so healing is very challenging. It's not a comfortable proposition. So we begin to examine the burden bundle, and we look inside, and we look at the family where we came from, and we see that maybe some of the sordid history that's a part of the addictions or the abuse or the violence, whatever that is. And then we also see the beauty. We see the blessings that we've also been that have been bestowed upon us. And so we decide to make a deliberate action to heal. And so we, with all that we have, all the tools within our ability, as well as what's in that blessing bundle, we begin to extract some of the items from the burden bundle. Now, if we go back far enough, we all come from a common humanity. So inside that burden and blessing bundle is all of it, all of our humanity. But what's going to be most apparent within that blessing bundle and burden bundle is what's in your most immediate environment: mother, father, aunt, uncle, grandfather, grandmother, right? So your immediate family will be the ones that are most prevalent, and that's often what we work with. And so if in the course of one's journey through life you can extract one item from that burden bundle, so that when it's time for you to pass on these bundles, either through having your own children or through being a mentor for others, because we can either enhance that burden bundle, or enhance the blessing bundle, or add to the burden bundle if we are a mentor or a teacher. If when you pass that on, that the burden bundle is smaller and the blessing bundle is bigger, you've done your job. Yeah. That for me is the key to waking up, to with ruthless honesty examine the pains and the wounds and the fears that have been passed on to us, right? Not for the purposes of indulgence or self-denigration, but with a level of sobriety and clarity and honesty and objectivity, so that we can heal ourselves and therefore heal those around us. That for me is the key to waking up, right? So that's the first objective of being a human being, right? The second is to fulfill our original instructions. I mentioned earlier that each and every one of us has a unique purpose and reason for being here that no one can inform you about. That's part of the discovery and the remembrance of being here, right? That's our job, right? And so using whatever faith tradition you have to help you remember, knowing also that everyone and everything that comes within your path is a teacher to help you remember. So even the tyrants in our life, even the people that pose challenge, are actually there to help us galvanize our remembrance of our original instructions, because they're also going to help us trigger the things inside the burden bundle, right? So there's a potential for great healing that can happen.
Right. So quite simply said, our enemies or people that we are giving us the hardest time can be our best teachers, where instead of taking negativity, we find the goodness within ourselves. Mm-hmm. And they're forcing us to make those choices, as you say. Yep. Which bundle are you going to choose? Right. What consciousness? And at that precise moment, we have to have this remembrance of this. It's not going to be an automatic response.
I don't use the word enemy for a reason, though. I don't believe that we have enemies, because I believe that we are all connected here, right? That we are all family. We're all related. Also, I have a colleague of mine who I respect highly, who's a medicine man from Zimbabwe, and he says, there are no enemies, only people whose stories we do not know. And I think that when we can drop the barriers, right, drop the separation and see that we are connected, then we can touch into each other's story. And that allows for great healing to take place, right? So our original instructions are unique to us, and our responsibility is to remember that. Now, the original instructions are not self-serving, but it involves selflessness, right? And if we do not fulfill our original instructions, it creates a collective suffering. So as I said, we are all connected here. So if you don't fulfill your purpose and reason for being here, then I and all of us are going to suffer, right? Because that gift is of service to all of our relations. So that's our second purpose for being here as far as I'm concerned. Thirdly, the purpose is to love unconditionally. And we place a lot of conditions upon our loving, but that's not the true essence of what that's about, right? To place conditions, to say that I don't love someone, right, is to create more boundaries to connection. Whereas inside our DNA, and you had John Trudell here not long ago, and he coined DNA as descendants and ancestors, right? So inside our DNA, as John Trudell would say, descendants and ancestors, is a direct experience of unconditional love on two levels. One is the level of our biological parents. Certainly our biological mother and fathers love us unconditionally. Now there are certain exceptions to that rule. So for those exceptions, there's always the unconditional love and nurturance of the earth and the source. So inside of our DNA and inside every cell of our body is an experience of unconditional love. And if we can remember from that place, then the way that we conduct ourselves in the world will be radically different. Because But see, we have fear, and we have judgment, and we have social conditioning, right? All of which prevents us from loving. So we learn how to negotiate love rather than being completely loving. But again, if we look at the source and the earth, not only for the love that they devote upon us, but who and what they really are, it's the embodiment of love and unconditional nurturance.
Give me an example of what unconditional love would be like in living it and being it, experiencing it.
Well, if we take a tyrant, for example, or someone who is being unkind to you, can you, rather than judge that individual, love them, right? Or
bring them understanding.
well, it's not necessarily an agenda that you try to bring them understanding, because that would be trying to force them to change. Right?
Well, not that you expect them anything from them, but you're just giving that to them within inside yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You bring understanding. You bring a connection there of not judging them and not being affected by the ugliness that they may be bringing to you. You see why they may be doing that and try to be at a neutral, loving place no matter what they're doing.
Sure. Well, that for me, that's, I think in all faith traditions they speak about this, right? So for me, love will transmute the poison of violence and hatred, right? So if someone's being unkind to you, you can either reciprocate with unkindness, which only creates greater violence, or we can express love toward that person, to with compassion, touch into the heart of the commonality of suffering, right? Or the violence that is going on inside that individual, that they're going to reflect that violence to the world. And so to bring the healing balm of love to that pain and that suffering, rather than judgment or further violence. Yeah.
So beautiful.
So that's the third, right? The fourth, as far as I understand, in my own experience, is for us to live interconnectivity, right? Not just as an intellectual concept, right? But to truly see that we are all related and we are all connected, and to live from that place, right? And all of those other things, right? So waking up, loving unconditionally, remembering your original instructions, all of that comes to bear in the fourth piece of the wheel, if you will, which is to understand that we are all connected in this together. So therefore, that our actions have far-reaching consequences that we may not necessarily comprehend, which is why, when we live from an insular place, from a place of self-absorption, we don't see how our actions and words affect future generations, right? If we did, then we would treat our Mother Earth with far greater respect and kindness. We would want to protect her, knowing that her survival is critical for our own survival and for 7 generations to come. You know? So living those 4 aspects of the wheel, if you will, allows us to walk and live in balance.
Right. Well, Philip, it's coming to a divine pleasure of an end, and it was incredible speaking with you, seeing you again, and I thank you very, very much.
It's a real pleasure
for all your
to be
work.
here.
And if one wants to get a hold of you, how does one connect to you?
Well, there's many different ways to do so.
You have a website?
Yes, so ancestralvoice.org is the website. The center that I have, that I founded and now currently direct, is in Novato. And so people can reach me through www.ancestralvoice.org. I do have an email address, which is Philip with 2 L's at ancestralvoice.org. And they're certainly welcome to call. I'm very traditional when it comes to this, so electronic media is not my preferred method of communication, but as we're doing, right, face-to-face, heart-to-heart. So I love to receive phone calls, so people can call the Ancestral Voice office at 415-897-7991. So those are 3 methods, and my community has been encouraging me, so I think we're in the process of developing a Facebook page for the center.
Okay, great. Well, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. From the Art of Conscious Living, do take care of yourselves and take care of others.